Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle. And for today, I'm doing something a little bit different. Today's episode touches on some very important things that are happening currently. Today's date is September 15th, 2024. I live in the United States of America in San Antonio, Texas. I live very close to the Mexico border, and immigration is something that is very, very popular to discuss right now. And today's story is about immigration. Or really, no, it's not. Today's story is about people who lived in a place who were made others by the state. This is a cautionary tale. This is a story that I know a lot of people know. It's a story that I know that a lot of the people listening to this podcast are very intimately familiar with. But originally I wasn't going to do this introduction. Originally I was just going to go in and do my normal thing, but I started reading the news a little bit. And there's been a lot of talk today, and in the previous days, about immigrants, particularly people from Haiti, and how they are not really Americans, and how they are changing America, and they are doing things that are evil and vile, and that they themselves are evil and vile. And then beyond that, again, living in South Texas, you hear constantly, even more so than just what's on the news or in politics, about the evils of Mexican people coming across the border who might be terrorists, or might be drug traffickers or human traffickers, or who are evil. And I want to tell you this story today, and I want you to think about that rhetoric, and about how the United States, a country of immigrants, of foreign people who have come here, how that story is not too dissimilar to the story I'm going to talk to you about today. And today's story isn't just a story of foreigners and of different people. It is a story of how the government crushed those people, and how the government hurt those people, and how the government tried to destroy those people. Fortunately, the people in today's story were not crushed. They were not destroyed, and they are still here. I personally am living proof of that. But I want you to think about the United States today. I want you to think about how today's story, and this story of violence and repression, and the story of next week, because next week's episode will likely be a continuation of today's episode in many ways, how those stories are playing out here. How the people coming into this country, or the people who this country came and gobbled up, are not enemies. They're not bad people just because they are different. And that argument and that line of thinking, no matter how minor, no matter how often you might go, oh, but I'm not really worried about all immigrants. I'm just worried about those immigrants. And, oh, it would be okay if they came here legally. And, oh, it would be okay if they weren't, not assimilating, if they weren't this, if they weren't that. No. Because I know for a fact that this story touches on a lot of people who are making these arguments. And I want everyone to think about this. And think about how, when we other others, we hurt them. And we make it so possible for the powers that be to hurt them. But now that I've got my preamble in, I would like to apologize a little bit for it. Normally, I don't like to make this a particularly political, at least not modern political podcast, unless, of course, like for, say, Alexei Navalny's case, it is something about modern politics. But history is inherently political. You cannot have history without politics, and of course you cannot have politics without history. And as well, I don't normally talk about countries that aren't Russia, but this is my platform, and I get to make the arguments that I want to. And I think this is incredibly important, because on September 15th, 2024, there are things that are happening in this country that are concerning, that are scary, and they should be for everyone. Doesn't matter if you're a Haitian immigrant, doesn't matter if you're a Mexican immigrant, doesn't matter if you are in this country because you came in legally or illegally. All of these things should bother all of us. So please keep that in mind as we go on to today's episode. So now to my actual script. For today's episode, we are going to be talking about something that I know many of my listeners are very intimately familiar with. But I also know that a lot of people overall are likely not. Today, we are going to be talking about the Pale of Settlement. If you don't know what that is, then let's start at the very beginning of the term itself. In this context, the word pale means a district separated from the surrounding country by defined borders or distinguished by a different administrative and legal system. That definition comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you know what the word settlement means. So what this is this is a pale, a special region with special rules and laws cordoned off from the rest of the country in which settlement is allowed to occur. The settlement that we are talking about that is happening in this area is that of the Jews. You see, before the 1770s, Jews weren't allowed in the Russian Empire. Russia, like every other European country of the day, was not a big fan of the Jews and didn't really want them. So, like many other European states, such as England, Portugal, or Spain, Russia did not allow Jews to exist inside the Russian Empire. The Jews were seen as outsiders and infidels. But then something happened. In the years 1772, 1793, and 1795, the three partitions of Poland took place. Basically, what that means is Poland was split into little pieces, and these pieces were taken over by Prussia, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And all of a sudden, Russia has all of these Jews on their hands, and they have to do something with them. You see, Poland had a really big Jewish population, the largest on Earth, and most of those Jews lived in the eastern parts of Poland, which just so happened to now be part of the Russian Empire. So, the Russian Empire had to do something. And that is what we are going to be doing today. Today, we are going to be talking about the legal steps that the Russian Empire took to create the Pale of Settlement. I would like to talk more about what it was like in the Pale of Settlement today, but I know that we are not going to have time. Today's script is pretty lengthy, and I've already wasted a bit of time going on my little preamble. So, unfortunately, we are not going to be talking about that today, but I will be doing that for the episode next week. So please do stick around for that to catch up on the end of our little mini-series on the Pale of Settlement. So for now, let's get into the legal framework and justification that created the Pale of Settlement. So, the Jews were technically illegally in Russia, but the Jews hadn't just shown up. The Russian Empire came to them. The Tsar's government couldn't really just kick all these people out, even though they certainly wanted to. There was nowhere to send them. No one else was interested in getting the Jews, and many other countries also had laws in place barring the Jews from entering their countries. As well, the Polish nobility were quite fond of their Jewish subjects. Jewish leaseholders were a huge source of revenue for the Polish nobility, and there were a ton of them. Getting rid of what would have likely been millions of people would not have been a really easy, cheap, or smart thing to do. So, the Russian government started off by trying to be cool. They legalized the existence of the Jews and gave them equal protections under the law, but that wouldn't last all that long. Also, a little note here. The Tsar was cool by the Tsar's standards. The Jews were technically allowed the same legal protections and rights as other Russian citizens, but one, this still meant that these people were not allowed to really own land and were basically owned by the local nobility, like all the other peasants in the Russian Empire. To learn more about that, you should go back and listen to our episode on serfdom. And two, the Jews were still more restricted than the average Russian peasant. This was where the Pale of Settlement gets its name. The Jews were only allowed to exist in the newly acquired lands from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and some areas that had been taken in Turkey. The Jews were not allowed to move into Russia proper. They were only allowed in the areas that are today Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and like I said, some parts of Turkey. So, to say that the Tsar was being cool, it's, again, by the Tsar's metrics. The Jews would only be allowed in certain places in the Russian Empire, and it would be strictly illegal for them to go or live anywhere else. Now, that being said, it was perfectly legal for non-Jewish Russians to come into the Pale of Settlement and set up shop, which is something they did quite frequently, but we will get into that a little bit more when we talk about what it was like in the Pale of Settlement. So far, This was all happening after the first partition of Poland in 1772. In 1783, things started to change for the Jews of the Pale. The Russian government, influenced by local racism and their own racism, decided that it was time to start removing the Jews. They weren't going to remove all of the Jews from Russia, but rather, they wanted to remove the Jews from rural parts and consolidate them in urban parts. This was for a number of reasons. One, it would be easier to control the Jews if they were all localized into tightly packed areas. Two, it was a common racist stereotype that the Jews were lazy and did not work the land properly, so it would be better to give the land to the non-Jews. Three, it was also a common racist stereotype that the Jews were a bad influence on the peasantry. In particular, that the Jews eroded the morals of good Christian peasants with alcohol, which is honestly a laughably stupid thought, because Russian peasants, the country over, were plenty drunk without the help of the Jews, but rather were getting hammered on czarist government-owned taverns drinking government-brewed alcohol. Now, to be fair, there was quite a bit of alcohol brewing going on in the Jewish parts of the Russian Empire, and these things would be illegal, and the Jews would not stop doing it. So, yes, there is a certain little grain of truth that the Jews are producing alcohol, but realistically, they are not what is causing the alcoholism of the Russian Empire. Again, all the way out in Siberia, where there aren't Jews, you have alcoholism. You have alcoholism in Moscow, where there aren't Jews. You have alcoholism in St. Petersburg, where there aren't Jews. And even in the Pale of Settlement, you have government-owned taverns that are producing alcohol, because the Russian Empire had a monopoly on booze. So again, not really true what all they were saying. And four, part of Russia's justification for partitioning off a slice of Poland was to protect Orthodox peasants from abuse by Poland's majority Catholic ruling class and their evil Jewish agents, a theory also based in racism. So in 1783, the Russian government started forcibly moving Jews from rural areas into urban areas. This is something that we like to call ethnic cleansing. These urban areas could be a number of things. They could either be smaller villages, generally known as shtetls, at least in Yiddish, or these folks could be moved into larger cities within the region like Kherson, Kyiv, Odessa, Minsk, Warsaw, whatever. But actually, this internal deportation scheme didn't last very long, because in 1786, the eviction of the rural Jews came to a halt. But why? Remember the last justification I gave? The one about the Catholic ruling class, how it was abusing their Orthodox peasants? Yeah, that one. Well, it's not entirely wrong. Much like Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's economy was based on a feudal system in which noble landowners owned land worked on by peasants, who were more or less the property of the nobility. So it is pretty easy to say that yes, the Catholic Polish nobility was taking very serious advantage of and mistreating their Orthodox peasants. But there are some important caveats here. One, the Jews were not involved in oppressing these people. The Jews were peasants just like the others. Two, the Polish nobility made a shit ton of money off this feudal system in which every peasant, no matter their religion, made money for their nobles. And three, it was basically the exact same system that the Russian Empire was doing at home. So what this means is the Polish nobility have a lot to lose if a bunch of their peasants, who are leasing land from the nobles and paying taxes to the nobles and making the nobles incredibly rich, are suddenly moved somewhere else. And it undermines Russian authority. Because, well, if I'm a noble in Siberia and I see the government just start stealing peasants from the nobles in Poland, who, remember, these peasants are more or less the property of these nobles, then I might get pretty upset too. Because who's to say the Tsar won't come here and take my peasants? And as well, it undermines Russia's whole system. Because the folks in Poland, they're not really doing anything wrong. And the Poles brought this up, said, how are we doing this wrong? Why are you taking our serfs from us and no one else's? So the Russian government backed down in order to appease the Polish nobility and protect their incomes. But even though the Russian government relented, it didn't mean that they actually agreed. The Russian government did not have a change of heart on the Jewish people in the Pale. They still saw them as undeserving, ungrateful underminers who were oppressing the good, righteous Christian peasantry of the region. They still wanted to do something about the Jews. But for now, they would have to wait until tensions died down between them and the Poles. But they wouldn't have to wait long. 10 years later, in the year 1796, there was a famine in what is now Belarus. And much like the Russian government, the locals were not big fans of the Jews either. While the local nobility saw the Jews as useful for their checkbooks, they agreed with the Russian government on everything else, as you can tell by the local response to the famine. The governor of Minsk, Zakhar Kornayev, said that the famine was entirely the fault of the Jews. The Jews were squandering the land they were given and were undermining the efforts of the hard-working non-Jewish peasants. In reality, the cause was the intensive farming practices employed by the Polish nobility who controlled the area. But hey, that includes Kornayev, and he's certainly not going to start taking responsibility when he just so happens to have a bunch of Jews lying around that he can pin everything on. So he does. Everything is the Jews' fault, and the calls for separating Jews from their land and deporting them to urban centers is once again at the top of everyone's minds. But these evictions would not happen for another 4 years due to the resistance of the Jewish community, who, believe it or not, were not exactly fans of being forcibly evicted from their land and sent somewhere else. But in the year 1800, there was another famine, and this time the Jews were not able to hold off the evictionist crowd. This time, the governor of Vilna, or Vilnius, Johann Friesel, wrote a proposal on the, quote, improvement of the Jews. Friesel was a Baltic German who modeled his plan on how the Prussians had dealt with the Jews that they had gotten during the partitions of Poland. What they did, and what Friesel wanted to do, was bar Jews from working in certain industries and only allow them to work as craftsmen and merchants. In order to do their jobs, Jews would be forced by economic pressure, rather than the government, to move into urban areas. The Russian government took stock of this plan and decided that they would need to do their own investigation in order to figure out what had caused the famine and what they were going to do about it. So, in 1800, the Russian government sent investigators to figure out what had happened. And, as you might imagine, the investigators came back and laid all the blame at the feet of the Jews. Interestingly enough, the investigators came back and said that not only was the famine the fault of the Jews, but also so was the low living standards and poverty of the Belarusian peasants, as opposed to the practices of the Polish nobility who controlled the land, which was actually what the issue was. But, never one to be weighed down by fact or reality, the Russian government investigators recommended that the Jews be forcibly evicted from the rural areas to urban ones. So, now the Russian government had to come up with a plan. To the Russian government, it was clear that the Jews were a huge problem, but they were unsure of how they wanted to fix it. Over the past 500-ish years, the countries of Europe had been experimenting with different ways of controlling their Jewish populations. The two most popular were total expulsion and ghettoization. Ghettoization was the concentration of Jews in urban areas, oftentimes with physical barriers and guards, keeping them locked in a certain part of the cities. And well, expulsion is expulsion. Ghettoization was very popular in the Catholic world after the Pope decreed in 1555 that the Papal States should create ghettos for their Jews. Russia was clearly toying with a version of ghettoization insofar that they wanted to restrict Jews to a certain part of the country, the Pale of Settlement, and to certain areas, urban ones, within that part of the country. But the Russian government was not super interested in spending huge sums of money on creating ghettos with walls and gates and guards to control the Jews, like what was common in Italy at the time, nor did they want to fully evict the Jews from the country, as had happened in England, Spain, and Portugal. Instead, they wanted something in between. They wanted to keep the Jews, but they didn't want them to have free reign. But they didn't want to have to try too hard either. They seemingly kind of wanted a system that would just be able to do its own thing and that they could more or less forget about. So, the Russian imperial government did what the Russian imperial government did best. It spun up the slow, crushing wheels of bureaucracy and created a committee to decide the fate of the Jews within the Pale of Settlement. In 1802, a committee on the improvement of the condition of the Jews would be brought into being, and in 1804, it would present its findings and recommendations to the Tsar, Alexander I. In December of 1804, Alexander signed their recommendations into law, what was known as the Jewish Statute. The Jewish Statute is a huge document with tons and tons of rules about the Jews, where they can live, where they can work, where they can go, etc., etc., etc. But the main takeaway for us today is that the Jewish statute made rural Jews illegal. But the Russian government would not get to that right away. The committee knew what its goals were, but it didn't really know how to make them happen. So, in 1806, a second committee on the improvement of the condition of the Jews was formed. And this committee was all about enforcement. The Jewish statute was in play, but how were they going to make it happen? Well, that's not a particularly easy question to answer. There were some that wanted strict, draconian enforcement in which the Jews would be forced off their land or else. Others wanted to move slowly because of concerns of cost and concerns that pre-existing shtetls would not be able to take in all of these rural Jews. And lastly, some didn't want to do it at all, not really because they cared about the Jews, but because they were worried about backlash. In particular, they were worried that the Jews of Russia might side against Russia and instead with Napoleon. But ultimately, two things happened in 1807 that brought this discussion to an end. One, the Treaty of Tilsit, I think is how it's pronounced, made Russia and France allies, so the concerns about Napoleon dried up. And two, Alexander I just went ahead and ordered the removal of all the Jews to begin with in the next 3 years. So, well, there you go. There was no more time to dilly-dally and discuss things like the feasibility of the plan. The Tsar had spoken, and the government got to work on removing the Jews from their homes. This all began with government officials going into the Pale and making lists of Jews, where they were from, what they did, and where they were going to be sent, that sort of thing. But then the process didn't really get much farther than that. Barely any Jews were actually removed as part of this program because the economic concerns voiced by the committee turned out to be just about 100% on target. Removing all of the Jews was insanely expensive and incredibly resource intensive, and shtetls and villages of the Pale were not developed enough to take in all of these new people and for there to be work and opportunities for them. And once again, the Polish nobility did not want to give up this huge source of labor and income that the Jews represented. So, in 1809, a third committee on the improvement of the condition of the Jews was convened, and their goal was to get things back on track. Even if it was expensive and unpopular with the Polish nobles, everyone else wanted the Jews gone. But the third committee would take their time on this one. It would take them 3 years before they would give their recommendations, and this time they would come back with a different story. The third committee formally absolved the Jews of guilt for the famine and for the poverty in the region, and recommended against deporting all of the Jews. But as you might imagine, no one actually gave a flying fuck what these guys had to say. The hatred for Jews was as high as ever, but for right now, things were stable. Well, that is until 1821, which saw yet another famine, and once again, more calls to evict rural Jews off their land. So, in 1821, an investigation was started, and this time, Alexander himself was going to Belarus. And wouldn't you know it, Alexander I, the man who wanted to do an ethnic cleansing so bad that he skipped the committee phase, came back and said, "Yep, just as I expected, it's them Jews," and ordered a fresh round of evictions. So, the date was set. In 1825, Russia would finally deport all the Jews. Or, well, that was the plan. In fact, Russia never would fully get rid of all the rural Jews. But before that could happen, there was a special eviction that needed to be carried out in one particular area. In the winter of 1823, some 21,000 Jews were evicted from the area around the city of Mogilev in Belarus. These people were evicted before all of the others because of concerns over their connections with illegal alcohol distilling and distribution. The region was near the border between the Pale and the rest of the Russian Empire, and it was a common place for people to smuggle imported or homemade alcohol into the rest of the Russian Empire and avoid the state monopoly. And if there's one thing that the Russian government is going to be pretty angry about, it's people fucking with the bag. So they went ahead and deported these people early. The Mogilev deportations would be some of the cruelest ones committed by the Russian government. These happened in the middle of winter, and the Jews were not provided any shelter, but rather were just kind of driven from their homes out into the wilderness and told to go figure it out themselves. I have no idea how many people died, but of the 21,000 people who were evicted, I'm certain it was thousands. And then, in 1824, a fourth committee on the improvement of the condition of the Jews was formed. This committee took a very long time to produce anything, and by the time they produced a report in 1834, they were giving their report to a new Tsar, Tsar Nikolai I. Once again, the committee recommended the eviction of all of Russia's Jews. Since like 60 years worth of attempts hadn't done it, certainly this one will. But interestingly enough, this recommendation was actually shot down. The Department of Law rejected these recommendations on the grounds that the previous evictions had been counterproductive. They said that the evictions had not created any improvements both for Jews or the non-Jewish peasants. So instead, in 1835, two laws were sent to the Tsar. The first one would legalize the existence of rural Jews, and the other one would officially end evictions. And well, Tsar Nikolai signed the laws into being, and for 5 years, the rural Jews of Russia were legally allowed to exist, and no one was going to be kicking anyone out. But then in 1840, the Tsar created a fifth committee. This one had a new name. This one was the Committee for the Determination of Measures for the Radical Reorganization of the Russian Jews. Really rolls off the tongue, right? Interesting that they changed the name, though. My guess is because when they change the name, they can kind of change the goalposts. You see, the last ones were all the committees on the improvement of the condition of the Jews. So that certainly kind of implies that the goal is to improve the condition of the Jews, something the Department of Law pointed out was not happening and was the reason for them shooting down the most recent committee recommendations. So it does seem likely, to me anyways, that they changed the name of the committee in order to streamline their attempts at just fucking over the Jews of the Pale. Wouldn't want bureaucracy getting in the way of your ethnic cleansing and ghettoization, now would you? So the fifth committee wanted to try something a little bit different. The forced removal of the Jews was slow, expensive, and not being particularly effective. So this time, they went back to Friesel's Prussian method of sorting Jews into specific industries. And in 1846, the Tsar signed off on this plan. An interesting note about this plan is this was actually a very common plan throughout Europe, infamously in places like Spain and Portugal before they removed all of their Jews. Jews were forced to be moneylenders, a particularly pernicious racist stereotype that has persisted to this very day. But because the belief at the time that Christians could not be moneylenders because it was usury, they forced Jews to be the usurious moneylenders. And wouldn't you know it, it gave people, particularly those in charge, a really great escape valve. So when people were fed up over, say, owing large debts to moneylenders, they could just point the fingers at the Jews and say, go after them. That is until, of course, they were all evicted from the Iberian Peninsula. But anyways, after the plan was signed into law, the Jews of Russia had until January 1st of 1850, just about 4 years, to register with the government as workers in one of 4 fields. These could be landlords, artisans, merchants, or farmers. If rural Jews did not register with the government, then they would be evicted and sent to urban settlements. But this time, the Jews were not strictly banned from living in rural places like they had been before, though it was still incredibly common for Jews to just be evicted anyhow. As well, there were certain things that would make this pretty difficult to work in certain of these four fields. For example, landlords. You would have to be basically a noble to own land at this point. And, well, not a lot of Jews were that. And then as well, farmers, even though they had, at this point, revoked the illegality of rural Jews, the vast majority of Jews had already been forced off of land. And even if they did live in rural areas, it is quite unlikely that they would have been farmers. I know I said that we would talk more about the Pale of Settlement and shtetls a little bit more in the next one, but it is important to know that the vast majority of Jews did live in urban and semi-urban environments. There were not a lot of Jewish farmers. And then in 1859, only 13 years later, we get a new czar, Alexander II, and he ended the sorting of the Jews, and once again, the Jews were back in their weird limbo state of being technically illegal outside of urban areas. And then, in 1861, Alexander emancipated the serfs. All of a sudden, the ties that bound the Russian workers to the land and their landlords and masters were broken, and the people of Russia were allowed to walk freely into the future of prosperity, freedom, and equality. Or, well, that's what Alexander had in mind. In reality, not much changed. For the Jews, literally nothing changed. The Jews were still bound to the Pale, and they were still being registered with the government, and the government still kind of wanted to make them all go away. And that is when a sixth committee is formed. This one was the Special Commission for the Reorganization of the Jewish Life, which just, Jesus, guys. And this committee was a bit special, says so in the name. It did all of the same stuff as before and said all the things about how the Jews were lazy and didn't use the land properly and how they oppressed the Christians and were degrading everyone's morals and all that jazz. But this time, they accused the Jews of being part of an international conspiracy for the very first time. For the first time in the Russian government's history, they are officially saying the Jews are part of a secret international cabal designed to destroy Russia and the Russian people. This is a claim that is still quite popular to this day, but especially then was very popular, and that the Russian government went out of its way to create evidence for. So this was a first huge step, and a very dangerous and nefarious one, especially because this isn't just a little subcommittee in some shitty town or something. Remember, these committees, they report to the Tsar. So that means that these ideas about the Jews are being fed to the highest levels of the Russian government. To this committee, their number one concern were Jewish landlords, which, mind you, there weren't a whole lot of them. They thought that the accumulation of Jewish wealth and land would ultimately result in an uprising by the non-Jewish peasantry. The committee pointed to the Odessa pogrom of 1871 as proof of this. The Odessa pogrom was a pogrom in which Russian peasants ransacked and murdered Jewish residents as a form of revenge for their perceived wealth and control of the local economy. And an interesting note about Odessa: it was a very Jewish city that was generally considered fairly liberal and more welcoming to the Jews. Seemingly, the thought was that if Odessa, a place generally more friendly towards the Jews, could spiral out of control over these issues of wealth, then anywhere was more than susceptible to it. But when the committee ultimately once again recommended evicting the Jews, the government turned them down. But the government did start becoming much more coercive towards the Jews. And then Alexander II was murdered in 1881 by a terrorist group known as the People's Will. Alexander II was a fairly liberal czar, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but in comparison, he was, who changed and updated many things about the Russian Empire. A number of people looked at him like the way that many Americans look at Lincoln. He was a mover, a shaker, a reformer, who generally was known for his softer approach to governance than many other czars. To many peasants, the Tsar's leniency and willingness to change, and less willingness to use force, was a welcome change. But to many, Alexander II was weak. He allowed Russia to become infected by communists, anarchists, and worst of all, the Jews. Interestingly enough, these issues were not actually what motivated his assassins, but that is for another day. Many people saw a gentler, even if only slightly, Tsar, and a more open Russia as a threat to the country and its traditions. One such person was the new Tsar, Alexander III. Alexander III hated all things not traditionally Russian, and sought to use force to mold Russia into what he wanted it to be. Under his reign, he oversaw large Russianization projects that attempted to force out the languages, cultures, and religions of the different nationalities within the Russian Empire. And his administration witnessed and actively participated in some of the worst violence that would ever be perpetrated against the Jewish people. Almost immediately after the death of Alexander II, people started blaming the Jews. And again, one such of these people would be the new Tsar. But hey, whatever, right? It's no big deal. So, in 1881, we saw a huge spike in pogroms, and the Russian government was completely nonplussed. Again, the Russian government oftentimes had no problem with these, and local authorities did little to stop them. Remember in our discussion of Rasputin? Remember the Black Hundreds, these nationalist organizations that went out and took part in these pogroms and drummed up fear against people who they saw as foreigners, outsiders, the Jews chief among them. Well, these people had connections to the Tsar and to the Tsar's government. So, we will talk more about pogroms in the next episode, but I want you and need you to know the Tsar was aware of these things, and he did very, very little to do anything about it. At the end of the day, the Russian government saw these violent outlashes as the natural reaction to the Jewish control of trade and commerce within the Pale. A level of control the Jews only had an outsized influence in because the Russian government specifically would not allow them to be anything other than merchants and tradesmen, since they were not allowed to work in rural areas, while Russian peasants were de facto forced into the lower-paying rural jobs, since the Jews were already there when the Russian peasants showed up and were already being forced into the higher-paying urban professions. But never the ones to be swayed by fact or reality, the Russian government did little to stop the pogroms that they saw as the result of Jewish wealth hoarding and power grabbing. Instead, in 1881, the government created a seventh committee. And in 1882, the committee actually opposed expelling the Jews. Instead, they recommended banning Jews from leasing land out to people and to force Jews to stay where they were at the time that this new law was signed. And in return, the government would stop the evictions. So, while the government was promising that they would no longer evict people from their homes, they were only hardening the ghettoization of the Jews and tightening the government control over their lives. But as well, these rules allowed provisions for Christian settlers to come into the Pale and evict Jews on their own. So sure, the government won't throw you out of your home, but your neighbor has every legal right to do so. And of course, if you were to say, go to the courts about it, we can probably all tell who the judge is going to side with. And of course, Alexander III signed these rules into law, which they would be law until 1917, when the Tsar finally abdicated power and the Russian Empire stopped being. To the Russian government and to Russian society, these new rules, known as the temporary laws, were put into place to defend native Russians against the better educated, more wealthy Jewish intruders. Russian conservatives pointed out other countries and how they had their own strict control on immigrants, foreigners, and minorities. One such example that they pointed to was the US and the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Russian government and its supporters framed the temporary laws as simply economic planning, purely intended to protect the domestic workforce, and that these laws were based in real economical considerations rather than simple bigotry. But it is clear that this was really not the case. While the Russian government and Russian society reeled against the wealthy, influential outsiders they believed the Jews to be, in reality, the Jews were quite the opposite. For one, the Jews were not foreign invaders. The lands the Jews lived on were taken by force by the Russian Empire. Russia came to them, not the other way around. The Jews had lived on that land for centuries and were more native than the Russians who showed up much later. 2. The economic position the Jews were in was only because of the legal framework set up by the Russian government. While it was true that the Jews did control large sectors of the local economy, it was only because the Russian government forced them through force, social, legal, and economic factors to be merchants, money changers, and artisans, and to live in urban rather than rural areas. And lastly, 3. The Jews barely controlled any land in Russia. Despite making up about 4% of the Russian population, the Jews only owned about 1% of the arable land in the entire Russian Empire. All of the concerns the Russian government laid out and stoked within its non-Jewish population were pure fabrications based on nothing more than racism and a desire to steal what the Jews had created for themselves, in spite of the draconian regulations and nebulous legal landscape that they were subject to. But racists aren't really the thinking type, now are they? If they were, they probably wouldn't be racist. So, the Russian government and Russian society cared little for the truth, and instead lashed out violently against the Jews of the Russian Empire. Along with the legal restrictions that arose in the last 20 years of the 19th century, arose the specter of things to come. This would be mass immigration of the Jews out of Eastern Europe, and the final solution to the so-called Jewish question that the Nazis would implement in the same territory only some 60 years later. But the Holocaust is beyond the scope of our discussion today, as by that time the Pale of Settlement didn't exist anymore. So for today, what I need you to know is that the Jews fled from the Pale of Settlement to all over the world. Many of them moved westward into other parts of Europe who were more welcoming to Jewish immigrants, even if just a little bit more welcoming. Some fled into the Ottoman Empire and Palestine, either as individuals just trying to flee the violence or as members of the early Zionist organizations attempting to create a Jewish state. And many fled to the United States until the 1921 Emergency Quota Act all but quashed Eastern European immigration to the US. And just a note on this. This happened because there were concerns about people coming in from different places who, and this is in big air quotes, didn't have American values, or were stealing American jobs, or were changing the face of America. So just a reminder to anyone out there who's afraid of immigrants, there's a really good chance your family was immigrants at one point, and people were saying the same things about them that they're saying about immigrants now. But anyhow, yet still more were stuck in the Pale of Settlement, where they tried desperately to carve out a normal, safe life, while the powers that be waged war against them in an effort to finally drive them off their land, as they had been since 1772. But, as always, the Jews would not be removed. And in 1917, the Jews of Russia would ultimately outlive the Russian Empire, as it fell to pieces into various states and armies that would battle for control of the various parts of the deceased empire. But now, the Pale was gone, and the Jews of Russia were allowed to move freely. And many of them did, as the years from 1914 through 1921 were horrifyingly violent years for them. During World War I and the Russian Civil War, it was common for soldiers of every stripe to take out their aggression and rage against the Jewish population. This included Russian soldiers targeting their own countrymen on the way to and from the front line. But still, many Jews remained in the areas that had once been the Pale of Settlement. Many were hopeful about the Soviet Union and its anti-Christian and anti-religious stances, while others looked to be part of the new emerging states such as Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the very shortly lived Ukraine. But more often than anything, leaving was hard, and it was expensive, and the road to anywhere else was fraught with arguably at least as much danger as staying put. So, stay put many did, and because of that decision, until the 1940s, the area that was previously the Pale of Settlement would stay the most populous region in the world for Jewish people. And with that, we'll have to wrap up for today. Please tune in next week, as I will talk more about what life was like in the Pale of Settlement. We will discuss in much greater detail the shtetls and the cities in which the Jews lived, the pogroms, and the economic and population realities of the region. So don't miss out on more fun and exciting discussion of the bleak, unpleasant reality of state-sponsored violence and oppression that befell millions of people for hundreds of years. But anyhow, I hope you learned something today, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, or even if you didn't, please don't hesitate to leave me a review on whatever platform you're listening on, as I'm always looking to make the show better, and engagement with the show does help the show grow. So if you do want to stay up to date on what's going on with the show, please follow me at BTRSpod on Instagram. And finally, I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.